Hi everyone. I'm here to talk, and I wouldn't call it the dreaded GDPR. If you ask me, if anything, for people who actually care about this, and I see there's quite a few of you here in the room, this could actually be an opportunity. And hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll also see why. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about myself. I do security and legal hacking. So basically, I hack people and companies that pay me to do it. And in this context, in the past year and a half or so, I've been looking into GDPR, and we've been looking into offering this as a service in the company that I co-own that will also be acting as sort of an external data protection officer. We'll see what that means in a moment. Now, just to give you a short overview of what we're going to talk about, I will do a high-level overview. The 45 minutes we have for this talk is by no means enough to cover a lot of the deep details on GDPR, but at least hopefully it will get you the general idea of what it means and what you should be looking at. We'll take a look at some of the articles, and I've chosen to highlight some of the more interesting or some of the pain points for some companies out there. I will then start to address some of the changes that will be needed in companies all over to be able to handle the requirements of GDPR. And I'll leave you with like a top 10 list of things to do if you want to start working on this today or tomorrow. Now, like I said, GDPR is quite a complex topic, and there's a bunch of items, and I will talk, I think, about all, if not most of them, over the course of the next 45 minutes. But this is just to give you an idea of the sort of concepts that you should be able to understand and be comfortable with if you are dealing with GDPR. And with that, I will start with a show of hands. How many of you are hearing about GDPR first time today? Okay, so not a lot of you. How many have heard about GDPR and know half or more than half of the things on the page? All right, so that's about half or a little over half. How many of you know that the companies they work with or for are already doing steps and are quite confident that they will handle GDPR by the time it comes into effect? Oh wow, you know what? There's no clear requirements of what GDPR compliant means, so the ones that raise their hand are actually clueless about what it actually takes to be GDPR compliant. So let's start with that. GDPR, as opposed to directives in the EU, GDPR is a regulation. Was anyone here in the panel, the NIST panel, earlier before lunch? Not a lot of you. So that's where they discussed the NIST directive. Basically, the difference between a directive and a regulation within the EU is that a directive is something that the EU decides that should be implemented in the member states, and then the member states have to pass a law to align with the directive. As opposed to that, a regulation does not require a law to be passed for it to come into effect. It is recommended for you to start aligning your local law to some of the new things that a new regulation might ask of you, but it's not something that you have to do for the regulation to come into effect. So this means that whether or not our local government does anything, this will happen. And this will happen to all the member states of the EU. And not only that, it will affect companies even outside the EU that collect, store, process, or deal with any data, any personal data related to citizens of the European Union. So that includes I don't know, Facebook and Google and whoever, if they're not an EU company, but they do collect, store, process data from EU citizens, they still have to comply to this regulation. It gets a bit more complex on how they get fined and whatnot, but usually if a country has a bilateral agreement with the EU, they will have to comply with this as well. Now, what the GDPR brings is actually not a bunch of new things, but it just changes or enhances existing personal rights dealing with data privacy. It increases and puts more pressure on companies to better protect personal data, because it comes with significant penalties as well. And it also includes mandatory breach reporting. So if your company has any sort of personal data, and if you're a company that has one employee, you are affected by this. Because that one employee, if he's a citizen of the EU, you probably have an employment contract. The employment contract has his personal data. So from that point on, since you have his personal data in any sort of digital or written form, you have to protect it according to the GDPR. So the mandatory breach reporting means that if your company goes through a data breach and any of that personal data gets compromised, made public, deleted, changed in any way, you have to report it to the local authority, to the local supervisory authority in the country you're in. GDPR, so the regulation was published in April of 2016, and it's been mostly unknown. People didn't really care much until I think this summer is when people actually started getting more into it and learning more about it. And the nice show of hands of like more than half the room of people that have heard about it and know a bit about GDPR is proof of that. However, it's not too long before it comes into effect. So they gave us a little over 2 years. It will come into effect in May of 2018. Essentially, what it does, like I said, is to clarify where responsibility lies when it comes to privacy protection, and it affects any companies who, like I said, collect, store, manage, analyze, process any sort of personally identifiable information. And as I mentioned before, whether you're a company within the EU or not, if you do this, you're affected. It aims to replace the current directive. Remember, directive and regulation. So there's this directive that is currently in effect, and the member states have passed laws to align with that directive. This aims to replace that, and it sort of also complements the recently introduced NIS directive, the one that was briefly discussed in a panel right before lunch. GDPR contains, anyone here read the entire thing? Oh, so compared to the more than half of the room who raised their hands saying that they know what GDPR is about, the 4 people that raised their hands that have actually read it, that's also a sign of the current state of things. It consists of 99 articles, which is basically this should be done. And then there's 173 recitals, which are just best practices, recommendations, and basic principles that are easily interpreted and will remain at the sole discretion of the member states on how they pass any sort of law changes within their countries to align with the GDPR. Since we don't yet have such an updated law, this means that we don't really know how this will happen in Romania. We sort of know the big picture, but you'll see when we browse the GDPR that it's a really big and fuzzy picture. There's no clear definition of a bunch of things in there. So answering to really specific questions of how does this work, does this apply to me, does this apply in this case or that case, is not clear yet. It's very fuzzy. What's not fuzzy is that if you go through a data breach, you could get fined. And the fines are, as you can see down there, for any major breaches, they can go up to 20 million euros or up to 4% of the global annual turnover, whichever is highest. And by global turnover means that if your company is part of a group, or it's a multinational company of any sort, they will take the global turnover of the entire company, and not just the country that got affected by the breach. For less important breaches, it's half that. Now, from our experience so far, like I said, we've already started doing this with our customers, and we've got a bunch of new customers. We've partnered up with a couple of law firms so that the legal aspect, because we're not really legal people, we don't talk legalese as well as those people do, so we've partnered up with a couple of law companies to try and help our customers align their processes, procedures, technical investments, and solutions. So we cover the process and technical side. Up until now, our experience has shown us that if you are to actually do something and be efficient about it, you need to have at least 4 entities in the room when any GDPR discussion takes place. You need to have the legal side. So you need either the company lawyer or lawyers or their law firm that they work with, so somebody on the legal side to be present. You need the organizational and procedural side, so anyone covering governance and management and also policies and operations. And you need the technical people in the room as well. It's not a technical thing, it's not a legal thing, it's not a process thing, it's all of them put together. So you need all these people to talk to each other, a thing that they rarely do, and just work things out. Beyond that, you also need to at least involve in some parts of the process the people in HR, marketing, finance, customer service, basically anyone in your company that deals with customer data, that deals with that data coming in or going out, and if that data is personal information, they need to know what they are exposing the company to. Now, I told you this is not a new thing. It's by all accounts, it's somewhat of an improvement of existing items, and this is specific to Romania in this case, but it also sort of applies to a lot of other member states. The current law dealing with personal data is that one up there, 677 for 2001. That also already gives you some rights. You're not getting those rights right now. You had those rights before. You might have not known about it. Anyone here that read that law? It's a 15-plus-year-old law dealing with how companies and the government has to treat your personal data. So it's probably relevant that if you haven't done it so far, at least go through the GDPR because it covers those things as well. But it also introduces a bunch of new items and a bunch of new rights that you have. For one, the right to be forgotten. The right to go to any company, or if we are to put it in GDPR terms, any data controller, any sort of company that collects and stores and then processes the data, and you can ask them, hey, if you've got any data that pertains to me, my personal data, I want you to delete it from your system. And there are cases where this might not be possible, because there's another law requiring them to collect and store that information for a specific period of time. For instance, you bought something from a store somewhere, and they had to give you an invoice, and that invoice contains your name, probably your social security number, and other data. The law, when it comes to invoices and finance and whatnot, says that you have to store all that data for 10 years. You can't delete all the invoices from your system in order to delete the data. So there's things that you might have to do because of other existing laws that will prevent you from deleting all that data. Now, if you've also collected the color of my eyes or my shoe size when I purchased something from you, now that's some data that you might have to delete, because it's not some data that you are forced to collect by an existing law. You're collecting it because you want to sell me more stuff, maybe. So in those cases, you'll have to be able to comply as soon as possible, as soon as the request comes in to that. The right to restrict data processing. You will have to both notify or make it easily available to all the people that you collect data for or from or about what sort of data you're collecting and for what purpose or purposes. This means that if you collect my information to both be able to send me the order that I just placed on your website to my home, but you were also collecting it because you want to send me a newsletter next month, or you want to process that data to know what people are doing on your site, I need to know about all the purposes that the data gets collected and processed. And I need to be able to opt in or out for any one of these purposes. So it gets a bit tricky. Then there's the right to data portability. Not only do I have the right to come to you and ask you, hey, what sort of data do you have about me? And I need to know, especially if you've got some data on me that I haven't given you personally, and you need to tell me where you got that data from. That's one. Two, you have to give me that data in a machine-readable format. You don't give me some screenshots and a PDF file and an Excel file exported from 3, 4, 5 different systems. I need that data to be in a machine-readable format because I need to be able to take it from you, the data controller, to another data controller. Say I want to change my mobile phone subscription. I want to be able to take the data off of the current supplier and give it to the new one that I want to go to and tell them, hey, this is all my data. This is what they asked me, so do whatever you want with that data. It's in machine-readable format. It could be like an XML file or JSON or whatever. How many systems do you think do this right now? Right? There's a bunch of other new items here. I told you about the mandatory data breach notification. So you have to notify the local authority within 72 hours from the moment you have found out about a data breach. Now, you could have been hacked a few months ago. That's yet another different discussion or problem. The fact that it takes, on average, anywhere between 6 to 9 months for a data breach to be discovered. That's the industry average. So that's how long a hacker stays in your infrastructure before you find out that they're there. Now, the moment you find out, you have 72 hours to report this. And in some cases, you also have to notify the people affected as well. There's also the DPO, the Data Protection Officer. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's semi-mandatory. There are some specific cases where you have to have a DPO. In all the other cases, it's recommended to have such a person, a Data Protection Officer inside your company, or that you can find on the market and you can pay someone to act as even a temporary DPO to cover all the requirements that a DPO has to cover. Then there's the talk about explicit and implicit consent, covering that in a minute. The introduction of concepts or requirements on data minimization and pseudonymization. What this means is basically don't collect more data than you actually need. And the data you collect, make sure that if it gets stored and processed in different systems, you only transfer the data that's needed in a pseudonymized fashion. You can transfer an ID and all the data about that ID, so you can tell who that person is. You have data about the person, you process it and bring it back. You don't have to take all the data you have here and put it in that system over there, simply because you need to use 3 of the 70 fields that you've collected to process the data in that other system. So make sure you only collect what you need. And especially when it comes to transferring data between systems or even within the existing system, make sure that it's as hard as possible for people who get access to that system to actually be able to identify who the data belongs to. Then there's the mandatory DPIAs, Data Protection Impact Assessments. Basically, if up until now it was a nice thing to sort of do risk analysis and pen testing and stuff like that every now and then. Now it will become mandatory when it comes to the risk analysis and the risk impact assessment for any sort of incidents related to personal data breaches. So you'll have to do this. And you'll have to prove that you've done this, and you'll have to provide these reports to the local authority if asked for when a data breach occurs. The privacy notices should be way more robust, transparent, and understandable, and they must explain, like I said, the sort of personal data that gets processed, the purpose, the intended retention, the rights that the subject has, the source of that data, especially if you've not gotten that data from the actual person and you've got it from somewhere else. You just bought a list of emails off the internet because you want to spam people with your amazing roof protection thingy, right? And you get all these emails with all sorts of services and products because somebody just bought off a list of emails off the internet. And there's some new addition to what personal data means. And it covers things like online identifiers and IDs and cookies and the concept of sensitive data, which now includes explicitly genetic and biometric data as well. The guys that deal with digital media or digital marketing will be the ones that are going to be hit first. Because GDPR affects how you collect the data from customers, how you do email marketing. The consent validation is a sensitive touch point here. You need to be able to easily apply that right to be forgotten. When somebody asks you to delete the data from your system, you need to be able to do that. And the explicit consent, I'm touching on that on the next slide. And also, if you do any sort of behavior tracking, you need to clearly state that. So right now, you know, there's the cookie law, where you enter a website and it tells you that you've got cookies. You're gonna have maybe one or two new pop-ups telling you that they're tracking you and they're collecting some other data as well. So you'll have to click for a bunch of those. It's gonna be interesting. Somebody really thought this through. But at least you know. And you're gonna click through it like you click through the cookie thing. It's the same. Now on the topic of explicit consent, and this is a section from the GDPR text. It says that any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data subject's wishes, and which he or she, and the bolded statement is by a statement or by a clear affirmative action. So that consent needs to be a clear affirmative action. Any sort of pre-ticked I agree boxes, no, they won't work anymore. You have to tick the I agree box yourself. That's a clear affirmative action. Or if you want to apply this to an existing list, if you send all your customers an email and tell them, hey, you know, this thing GDPR requires me to get your consent, please say yes. And if you don't, I'll just assume that you said yes. Silence is also not explicit consent. So you need explicit consent and clear action to exist. And you need to be able to prove that. You need to be able to prove that the client ticked that, or said yes, or sent you an email that said yes, or confirmed it through a phone call, or something. So that's going to get tricky. However, you can still process data without that consent in some cases. If you have a contract with the individual that says that you will process that data, if you need to comply with a legal obligation, some other law saying that you need to collect that data in order to, I don't know, send out an invoice, vital interests and public tasks, and this is more of a talk for the legal people, because it really depends, and there's no clear answer or definition on what vital interests are or how they apply to personal data and where the line gets drawn, or even like a public task, that's also a bit fuzzy. However, if you talk, and this is also something that you will have to prove or discuss in case it's needed, what's called legitimate business interests. Going back to my example, you've got a shop online, you're selling stuff to people. If you want to send them the product at home, you need their address. You don't need it for other services, but in order to ship it, you need the name and address that you need to ship it. Now, you don't need the explicit consent of the person saying that yes, I agree that I give you the data for you to ship the stuff to me. However, you need to be able to tell that if I only use that address to send you that shipment and I don't send you Christmas cards as well, that's okay. If I want to send you a Christmas card, I'll have to explicitly state that. I want to be able to send you a Christmas card every now and then. That's a different purpose. You need to agree to that. Also, legitimate business interest means that at some point during this process, I might give this to the courier company that will deliver the package. It's not me that's going to deliver this. It's going to be a third party. So the data that you gave me will now get transferred to them for them to bring you the package. This could also go into this legitimate business interest, and you will be told that by filling in this form, you're giving me the permission to send this to a third party for the parcel to be delivered. Just stating that doesn't require them to explicitly agree. DPOs, like I said, having a data protection officer is mandatory if, one, you're a public authority. So any public authority will be required to have a person who will act as a DPO. If you are performing large-scale, constant, and systematic monitoring activities involving personal data. So even if you're not a public authority, but you do perform any sort of large-scale stuff that involves that data, you also need to have it. It's mandatory to have it. Or if you're processing any sort of large amounts of sensitive data. For instance, if you're a private hospital, you're processing sensitive data, such as health data, you need to have a DPO. It's still recommended to have a DPO anyway. So the local authority in Romania, which is ANSPDCP. Anyone heard of it? Autoritatea Națională de Supraveghere a Prelucrării Datelor cu Caracter Personal. Dataprotection.ro. Right? Nobody really heard about them until GDPR showed up. So it's there. But they'll be the ones giving out the fines. They'll be the ones making sure that things are going on okay. And right now, they're quite understaffed. So by the time GDPR comes into effect, I think that's only going to get worse. The roles, these are the roles that a DPO has to cover. And the recommendation is to not have somebody in management doing this. This is very important. Because he's the one that also is supposed to be monitoring that things are being done. So if you're both accountable and responsible of the thing, you're just going to say, yes, it's done, because you're also accountable for that being done, not only responsible for implementing it. Like it's mentioned out there, the DPO needs to inform and advise the company, the operator, and its employees on what GDPR is. He needs to monitor the compliance and that the company does something to become compliant. He needs to be able to advise the operator regarding those data protection impact assessments and also to oversee their execution. He doesn't have to do them, but he has to be there and make sure that they get done. He also needs to be able to, he's the one that does the notification in case of data breaches. This is, I think, Article 34 that says that if the data breach involves any sort of data that can put the person at risk, not only are you obliged to notify the data protection authority, you also need to notify the people themselves. So you need to find ways to notify all the people that get affected in case that happens. And, of course, that's the person cooperating with the DPA. Now, why should companies care here? Well, currently, with the current law, the maximum fine is anywhere between 1,500 to 500,000 lei, right? The GDPR comes with much higher fines. And for 2%, you need to be breaking Article 28, 31, 32, or 33. You don't do impact assessments, you don't notify the supervising authority about the breach, or you don't have your records in order. Then you get fined. When you do the really bad stuff, like you violate the basic principles related to data security, which they don't define in the regulation, They just say you need to abide to those basic principles, but they don't give you a list of what those basic principles are, which makes it funky. Then they can fine you with even higher sums. Now, from our experience so far, so dealing with companies out there, most companies either haven't heard or know very little about GDPR. Even the ones that think they know. They've heard GDPR, they know it's something to do about data processing and private data and whatnot. That's not enough. Because, for one, there's no clear process in place internally within those companies right now to deal with data governance, with formal data classification. In order to be able to protect personal data, you need to know where that personal data is. Are you collecting it? What sort of data are you collecting? Where does it get stored? Who gets access to it? For what purpose? You need to be able to do all that. And rarely, if ever, that's the case, because usually you don't even have formal data classification processes. You don't do data discovery, or it's very hard for you to know where all the data gets stored and processed and transferred. It just is. It's data. Right now, it's going to be data and personal data. And you need to be able to tell the difference anywhere inside your organization. You need to be able to look at a stack of papers this high, right, all the archive, and you need to be able to tell this is a piece of paper that has personal data, and this one is a piece of paper that doesn't have personal data. And you need to be able to do that for both printed or digital data, regardless of where it's stored and so on. There's a lack of processes when it comes to data anonymization and pseudonymization. Shadow IT. Who knows what shadow IT is? So shadow IT is all the stuff that people in the company use that's not mandated by the company. Say you use Dropbox to transfer a file from the company file server to your personal account so that you can work on it while at home or in a hotel or at a customer, but the company doesn't have a company Dropbox account that you use your personal one. Nobody monitors that. The IT guys probably don't even know that this is happening, and this is happening a lot, especially when it comes to transferring files. Who here has ever used a non-sanctioned file transfer solution? It could be Google Drive, Dropbox, Transfer.ro, or whatever, right? It was not mandated by the company, so this stuff happens. This is how information gets out, and it gets out in a way that IT doesn't have any control over it. Explicit consent, rarely obtained. Now it's going to be mandatory. There's little or no logs of any sort of personal data processing. You will need to know who has access to any sort of personal data, when, and to what purpose. If you've got a CRM, and you've got some contact information for a company, and that person has his phone number and his company email, that's personal data. Personal data is any sort of data that can help you identify a person. So now you need to be able to tell which one of your sales guys has opened up the contact details for that person, and when and why. There is insufficient employee awareness and a huge lack of skilled people dealing with what the GDPR needs and what needs to be done. And there's a lack of security by design and by default measures. So let's just jump through a few of the items in the GDPR. Article 4, for instance, deals with definitions. So if you go to the GDPR and look at Article 4, it defines a bunch of stuff, including what personal data is, what processing is, and what's a personal data breach. Now, to sum things up, personal data is basically anything that could identify you. It doesn't have to be your name, email, and address. It could be anything. It could be, a male age 25 to 35 living in that city and driving a blue BMW and earning this amount of money per year. If that piece of information leads to identifying you, that's personal data. So it gets tricky. When it comes to personal data, there's a layer on top of that, the sensitive data, the stuff that could put you at risk, where the operator needs to also notify you. Now, the GDPR does not contain any explicit list of personal data that would fall into this category, but the supervisory authorities have already published some guides all over, including our guides. They published a guide that's a few pages long back in September, saying some stuff about what GDPR is and what the DPO requirements are, but that's about it. That's about all they really did. If you look at some of those best practices, there's a bunch of data that is clearly identified as having increased sensitivity, like biometric genetic data, financial economic situation, usernames, passwords, or data that could be misused for identity fraud, or special data. Now, what's special data? It's the part of the personal data that's strictly prohibited for you to collect, store, and analyze unless you have a very narrowly described use case or a very specific reason for doing so. Right? And this is a list of such data. Article 5 talks about the principles related to processing personal data. And one of the points here, so 1F, says that personal data shall be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data. Now, GDPR does not come to define what appropriate security means. So the person coming in and giving you fines, they could tell you what appropriate security means, what they think appropriate security means. And whatever you do, it might never be enough or appropriate. Because obviously it wasn't appropriate if you've gone through a data breach. It was not enough, so it's debatable. But it says you need to protect it against accidental loss, destruction, or damage. Now, I got asked a couple of months ago, well, if the hacker comes in and deletes the data, the personal data, why should I even care? Because he deleted the data, it doesn't get breached or made public or anything, right? Problem solved. He deleted the data himself. Well, yes and no. You can think of cases where deleting the data might put that person in danger. Think of a medical institution that has information about all their patients. Somebody hacks in, deletes all that data. One of the patients comes in the next day and needs to get his treatment. There's no history, so the doctor might give him a prescription that puts him in danger because there's no history, because it was deleted. So even the deletion could be dangerous. Article 15, the rights of access of the data subject. So as the data subject, you need to be able to ask the controller, the data processor, the data controller, all this information. Then they will have to tell you the purpose of the processing, the categories of data concerned, the recipients, or categories of recipient to whom the personal data has been or will be disclosed. Like, for instance, that store giving your data to the courier company. And where possible, the period for which the personal data will be stored, or if that's not possible, the criteria used to determine that period. So any company, in some cases, they won't be able to tell you we store it for 3 months. But they will have to tell you we store it until X happens. And they will have to give you that criteria. This goes on. So point E, the existence of the right to request the controller a rectification or erasure. You can ask for the data to be corrected or erased. The right to lodge a complaint with the supervisory authority. Where the personal data is not collected from the data subject, you need to be able to tell them any available information as to their source. And you also need to know about the existence of any automated decision-making, including profiling, and at least meaningful information about the logic involved. And you should be able to object to that. Any sort of automated processing that will have the system take a decision that affects you, and it's fully automated, you can object to that. If you think that maybe it's buggy, maybe the programmer that wrote the code, the logic behind it, put a zero or didn't put a zero somewhere, and the whole logic went haywire. Article 25 defines data protection by design by default. And this basically states that the controller, so the company doing the difference between the controller and the processor. The controller is the entity that decides what sort of data gets collected. The processor is just an entity that stores the data and processes the data on behalf of the controller. You could think of this in the terms of cloud providers. Like Amazon and Microsoft and Google would be data processors. They're just selling you compute power. They don't have any sort of influence over what data you put in those virtual machines or databases, but the data will still reside there. So they are the data processors. They have some responsibility in protecting that data, not full responsibility. You're the data controller. Now, as the data controller, you need to implement data protection principles, such as, but they don't give you a list of the data protection principles. If you don't do it, however, that's going to be trouble. By default, only personal data necessary for a specific purpose should be processed, and you also need to demonstrate compliance with the previous 2 points. Article 32, when it comes to security of processing, the controller and the processor shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. What does that mean? We don't know. So this is to the people that think that their company is going to be compliant. Well, let me know what you're doing there, because I surely don't really know exactly what's going to be required. I know some of the best practices and recommendations, and you can start with those, but you can't tell if you're going to be 100% compliant. And you can see the pseudonymizing, encryption, the CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability, regularly testing, assessing, and evaluating that. So you need to be able to, that's mandatory. So actually, it asks companies to do basic security, but it's mandatory, and you need to be able to prove that you've complied to that, because in case of a data breach, that's going to be ammo that you can use to prove that, hey, I've at least done my best, I've done this and that and that and that, and maybe, just maybe, you can get away with just a slap on the wrist and not 20 million euros in fines. Article 33, when it comes to notification, this is the notification to the Data Protection Authority. This should be done no later than 72 hours. Article 34, I haven't included that. That deals with the sensitive data or the data that puts people at risk, but you also need to notify the people as well. So no later than 72 hours, without undue delay, as soon as you become available. And not only do you have to just tell the data authority, oh my God, we've got hacked. You need to document the data breach. You need to include the facts related to that, its effects, and any remedial action taken, or that they are currently taking. You're not going to discover the process within those 72 hours. You need to have that process in place beforehand. Now, if you look at the main actors, like I said, in Romania, it's ANSD-DCP. You'll get the slides. This one goes to their website. It's dataprotection.ro. This Data Protection Authority is the one that keeps in touch basically with the data processors, the data controllers, the DPLs within each company, and also all the citizens that might have their data stolen, compromised, or worse. Now, when it comes to the changes, to sum things up on the changes side, for one, individuals have the right to access their personal data, to correct any errors there, to erase that, where it doesn't interfere or go against any other existing laws, to object to processing of their personal data, so you need to be able to tell the exact reasons why you're processing the data and to object to that, and to export that data. Organizations will need to protect that using appropriate security, and this is where the GDPR leads us, to notify authorities of any data breaches, to obtain the consent, and to keep detailed records when it comes to data processing. They also need to provide a clear notice of the data collection, to outline the purposes and use cases when the data gets collected, and to clearly define the retention and deletion policies. And also, when it comes to IT and training, they need to train their people. They need to audit and update any sort of policies they have. It's recommended to employ that DPL and to make sure that any sort of vendor or supplier contracts are updated to include or to cover for this. When it comes to the journey, getting started basically needs you to go through 4 very simple steps. You first need to discover where you have that personal data, what sort of personal data you collect, and where you have it. Then you need to take control over it. You need to be able to easily modify it, delete it, and things like that. So that's the manage side. You need to be able to then protect it, to enable to push in the security measures and controls to prevent, detect, and report any sort of vulnerabilities and data breaches. And the reporting side, to keep any sort of documentation that will be required, because in those 72 hours, you won't have enough time to go through all of that. And I've let like a set of bullet points for each of these 4 things. When you discover any sort of data that helps you identify a person, and this gets stored in all sorts of places, right? So it's all over. You need to be able to find it anywhere. You need to be able to manage it, policies, roles, responsibilities. Wherever that data is, at rest, in process, in transit, in memory, is it being processed, is it being archived, where's the backup? You need to protect the backup, because that includes all the data as well. You need to be able to organize and label. So data classification, appropriate security, right? Any sort of physical protection, identity management, encryption, all the good things that people have been talking about for years when it comes to security. You actually have to start doing that, and you have to start monitoring and detecting intrusions. You need to be able to tell as soon as possible that you've been breached. And you need to be able to report that, right? And to include all the data that's required. And in summary, a quick checklist. For one, you've only got 6 months. It's not enough. Even if you start yesterday, it's still not enough, right? But even so, you can think of GDPR as an opportunity and not a threat. If you do this right, you'll have an edge on the market. Any sort of services you provide to your customers are going to be GDPR compliant. You're going to be able to ask for more money from your customers, or you'll be able to just sleep well at night if you've done this. It's an easy decision. You either do it or you don't. You do it, and it's going to be a long road, or you don't, and you just take on the risk. You can opt for that. It's a valid business decision. It might be a business decision that leads to your business going out of business, but then it's a valid business decision. You need to get an inventory of the current governance frameworks and practices, and here my recommendation is to look into COVID-5 as sort of like an IT governance framework, and to appoint a DPO. Also, have that risk assessment done, launch an awareness program internally. You need to have those incident response plans. That shouldn't be just, oh my God, we've been hacked, what do we do? That's not a valid incident response plan. You need to focus on the information. Don't forget, this is all about personal data, and that's it. And you need to do that continuously, to continuously assess and see where you are and where you need to be.